Hi, folks. My name is Susan, as some of you know. Thanks so much for joining on this Friday's POSTHOC Salon, where we are going to try and learn from Rachel Feltman at Popular Science how to decipher truth from rubbish in science news. We have so much science news these days that's being blasted out on the front page in our home pages of news and in print newspapers, and science is really having its day. But how can we tell what is for real and what isn't for real? The motto of the Royal Society in the UK is nullius in verba, which loosely translated means take nobody's word for it, but we will take Rachel's word for it. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Susan.
We definitely want to take your word for it. So yeah, Rachel is an editor at Popular Science, and she's a podcaster and a frequent guest at the in-person old school analog salons that we have in New York. So thank you so much for joining today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And for educating us, because science news is everywhere. I feel like business journalists have been having their day in the sun for a long time, and now all of a sudden, folks like you are suddenly front and center.
Yeah, well, there certainly is a lot of health and science news right now, so it's been a stressful time.
Yeah. What did you say? It's stressful? No.
Oh, well, you know, it's like a stressful time for health and science journalists. Yeah. There's a lot of news to cover, but it's also it's such a rewarding time to cover what we cover at Popular Science. You know, we really write for a general audience. We meet people wherever they are. So I feel very fortunate that you know, we have a job where we get to actually help people sort through all of the information that's out there. And we definitely, me and other members of my team and other science journalists, have a lot of tools in our arsenal that really, you know, prepared us to cover news like this. And I do not envy readers who are encountering this amount of health and science news for the first time. It's a lot to wade through.
Right. You just said when you were speaking about Popular Science that you write for a general audience. I mean, that was something I was going to ask you is how do you write for folks from all different education levels? Because I think it's known if you have less education, you know a little less about science. So Pew Research tells us. How do you write for a general audience?
Sure. I think at PopSci we really focus on people who are interested in science, but maybe don't realize they're interested in science yet. And we really think about readers as people who are better able to understand and appreciate science than they have been led to believe. So
that's nice. You're putting the reader on a pedestal. That makes me feel good.
I really do think everybody can and should love and understand science. And a lot of it is about cutting out the jargon. You know, we never want to oversimplify. We don't want to dumb things down. But working as kind of a translator, there is a lot that a science journalist who's used to digesting large amounts of information and, like I said, really translating them, there's a lot we can do to cut out some of the language and the math that can make science feel really inaccessible, even though it doesn't have to be.
Whenever I start to see some math, I feel like I can't understand it at all. It makes no sense to me. And I suppose some people also, they see words and they get a little freaked out, and they're better at diagrams or drawings. So, you know, it's a mixed bag, right?
Absolutely.
So how can the general public, if they see a piece of, you know, science news, what are a couple of tips that you would give for them initially so that they can both be curious and have a little dash of skepticism as well?
A lot of my biggest tips come down to like red flags to look out for, which a lot of them are the same as you might look for in any piece of journalism. But for whatever reason, I think because we do kind of put science on this pedestal and think of it as something that's hard to understand, a lot of readers kind of shortchange themselves and don't.
Scientists are smarter than us too, right? I mean,
exactly. And you know, scientists are just people. Some of them are really, really smart. And
we put them on a pedestal, and I think right now they're definitely sort of considered gods, whereas maybe some people wouldn't consider a CEO that way so much. I don't know.
Sure. Well, but similarly, you know, if you're looking at a piece of journalism about a new tech company that's really putting the CEO on a pedestal and really being super laudatory, a lot of people who would know to be skeptical of that don't recognize the same red flags in a scientific article. And to be fair, there are lots of people who wouldn't recognize those red flags in a piece of tech journalism either, but
right.
I can speak to the science at least. So one thing that we talk about a lot in the world of science journalism as like a trope that's really important to avoid is the idea of the breakthrough moment, the aha moment. So obviously there are some really cool stories in science about the moment when it all came together, or you know, a big leap in our knowledge or in our scientific understanding of something. But the truth is that most science happens very slowly, very incrementally. And so one thing I always tell readers to look out for is a story that seems to say, this has completely changed the game. It's revolutionizing everything. Because
revolutionize, I mean, right there, it's like beep, beep, beep. It might have come from a press release.
Right, yeah, where it's like breakthrough, where it's like game changer. And just because, again, science isn't supposed to work that way. If we're doing things right, we should be getting closer and closer to an answer, and then maybe realizing we were wrong about something and getting closer and closer. So there can be those little aha moments that, you know, sudden realization someone in a lab had, but that's going to be something that's building on years and years of research. So again, those revolutionary moments are generally too good to be true. And in the same way, geniuses are usually too good to be true. Like I said, scientists are people, and some of them are incredibly smart. Lots of them are, you know, smart, and some of them are not so smart too. You can be a scientist, and it's any field. You can be a scientist and be not that smart.
There could be crappy scientists out there, just like there's crappy anything, right?
There are. It's true. But the idea of you know, this lone wolf, this genius who has figured it all out, who's changing the game, again, that's really not how science works. And even most of the big geniuses we think of in the history of science, you know, we talk about Einstein, you know, Einstein still did a lot of collaborative work. It wasn't like every morning he woke up and said, like, I, Einstein, have come up with this game-changing theory. You know, most of the papers that people like Einstein publish are collaborative and, you know, slow buildups of cumulative science. So again, anytime a reader sees an individual scientist claiming to have, you know, revolutionized it, it is probably too good to be true. So, you know, yeah.
As you're talking about this, you may know that this, I don't know. My grandfather was one of the guys who discovered insulin.
Yes.
And he was very young when he did it. I mean, he was like, you know, in college at the time, 21 or something. And I'm going to have the story. It's not going to be entirely right factual. I wasn't around then. But anyway, it was a summer. It was like 1921 in Toronto. And he discovered insulin, but I guess the lab was a mess. He's 21, and then he lost it again. He lost it, and then they had to like rediscover it again. But anyway, yeah. So those aha moments also just maybe, you know, they come and they go, and it's messy, and then, you know, that's why multiple people tend to get Nobel Prizes and those big prizes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are large camps of people inside the sciences and outside them who actually argue that prizes like the Nobel Prize are, you know, outdated and flawed, because even giving 3 people a prize for a discovery is just makes people, you know, misunderstand the process of science.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us about confirmation bias when we read something and I'm like, okay, I want to believe that. I want to believe that there is a cure for COVID tomorrow.
Yes. Science journalists think about confirmation bias all the time, because it's one of the things that makes covering climate change really difficult.
Can you describe to us what it means? We all have it, but we might not all know the term.
So confirmation bias is our brain's tendency to look for things that support what we already believe. So you are very good at hearing something and connecting it to your belief system, and using it to support what you already believe is true. And then the counter of that is that we actually have a psychological tendency to double down on our beliefs if we hear evidence that is contrary to them. So for whatever reason, we have really evolved to knuckle down and double down. And confirmation bias is tricky because, as you said, when we're reading something, we have all of these biases already floating around our heads. We want to hear that things are going to turn out well. We want there to be a cure for COVID. We want there to be a vaccine. So if we read something that confirms that and supports that, we are more likely to believe it than something that runs counter to what we are hoping to hear. So yeah, that's always very difficult in science, fact versus belief, because again, people don't even realize that they're cherry picking information. It's not even, we do have this problem of people seeking out news outlets that they think are going to tell them what they want to hear. But even if you're not doing that, once you sit down and read an article, you're still subconsciously cherry picking the information to consume and absorb what you want to hear.
How, as rational humans, we all like to think we're rational when we're reading news. How can we create our own personal news filter to not totally be sucked into our own confirmation bias? Are there a couple of 1, 2, 3 steps that you could give us?
I wish I had figured this out. I wish I had a perfect answer, but there are a few steps you can take.
Okay.
Consciously seeking out new news sources. Now, I will say they should be trusted and vetted news sources. You shouldn't feel like you have to go read what are clearly conspiracy theories just so you get all sides of the story. You don't have to do that. But let's say you realize you've only been reading US news sources. Reading some global news sources could be a great first step. Most Americans get their news from links on social media. So just kind of getting outside that algorithm and like going to the homepage of a few different news publications can be a great first step in just branching out outside of what algorithms think you want to read.
Exactly. Just giving you what you want to read.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just, being a skeptical and critical thinker, it really comes down to questioning your own reactions to what you're reading, which is easier said than done. So I would say for anyone who is concerned about their confirmation bias, you might want to just like make your news reading more of a slow, contemplative process, and maybe you'll start to just question those immediate reactions you have to the information you're reading.
Slow information. Okay, let's start with the headline though, right? I mean, sometimes you just know when you see a headline, you're like, that cannot be real. That headline, let's take YouTube out of it because you can game the algorithms a bit there on YouTube. But if it's a major news publication and it has, say, a question mark in it or something, should we believe it?
Well, headline conventions, there are a lot of trends in how outlets write headlines. So I wouldn't say there's any kind of headline construction that you should just like never click on and never believe. But for science stories, headlines should almost never be completely declarative for a science story. or at least not for really.
Nothing's really absolute either. Science wants to be
Right.
absolute, but it's all about discovering and a lot of wrong, as it turns out.
Absolutely. So a headline that sounds like it's kind of hedging is probably actually the better story than one that's really declaring that something has been done. Words like might and maybe are actually great signs that you're reading good science and health journalism, which is a little counterintuitive. People want they want to hear that something has been done, not that something might be a step towards doing something. So searching for those slightly less trumpety headlines is difficult, but important. But again, outlets need you to click, so there is some amount of just trying to get your attention. And
Sure.
perfectly good news stories can go a little crazy on the headline. So that's something that I would be a little less cautious about than other parts of the story.
A front page story this past weekend that I posted on social media. And it was in the San Francisco Chronicle. It was great. It was a 3-page article on some science being done up at UCSF, trying to find a cure for COVID. But the headline cracked me up because it was, they tried different headlines as well. But the one that I saw in the print Sunday newspaper was "Catching a Killer." I was like, oh, wow, that one really got my attention. But it wasn't necessarily what you thought it was going to be when you read the article, which was the work that was being done in a lab. But it was a great headline. Terrible news tends to make people click. Does good science news make people click as well?
Well, so we talk a lot about counter programming these days.
What does that mean?
Meaning that we want to remind people that there is stuff going on in the science world other than COVID. So we do still have people click on good news. And people definitely click on good news about COVID. But it's true that there is a lot of kind of like disaster porn and tragedy porn in journalism these days. I did, yeah.
Oh. Okay.
But there is a lot of like grabbing eyeballs by. It is kind of a confirmation bias thing because a lot of people are spending their time thinking about how bad things are, which is very understandable. So then you see a headline that's like, and now this, and that does get people's attention. But I like to think there's still a market for good news. I hope people don't just want to be miserable all the time.
Space news always seems to be very popular to me. I feel like
yes, people do love space. I think it has an element of escapism to it.
Of course, right?
Yeah.
We're not here. We can go elsewhere. I know we've done a fair number of space-related salons. A topic that, it's interesting, but I'm not thinking about moving to Mars anytime soon. But they're so popular, and one does end up catering to one's audience,
Yeah, stories about black holes. There was a story this week about astronomers finding the closest black hole to the solar system ever. Still very far away, but people love that. The answer is always it's really far away. It's never doing a thing to us, but people love to hear about the black hole that's now closest to us.
Any trends in science news that you see at Popular Science and your team sees?
So obviously, right now, a lot of people are thinking about the pandemic and how it will turn out. But in the months of the news cycle leading up to that, one trend that I had seen a lot of was the intersection of science and wellness, because obviously there's a lot of wellness that's very much not scientific.
And people love it.
Yes, they love it. Yes,
big companies. I'm in California right now. We're ground zero in LA for I don't know, maybe not such truthy science and wellness. We love it.
But, even from a more scientific standpoint, people are thinking about how to optimize their lives in a way that's very different from the way we were talking about health and wellness just a few years ago. So a big trend I've seen are people talking about fitness and nutrition and sleep and products for their home, because PopSci does cover tech and consumer products, of course, and they're talking about them in terms of wellness. So there's now this intersection of science and tech and wellness that actually allows for companies that are doing genuine innovation in that space.
And there's so much more investment. I can't remember the number. We did a salon a couple of weeks ago, and I can't remember like how many billions in 2019 that went into, because it's a big category.
Yeah.
That includes everything in health and wellness.
Yeah.
And do you think there's more of a trend towards that when the times are sort of shitty and people are trying to improve their lives and something that they can control? Like I can try and control my sleep. I can't control whether I can go hang out with my friends so much right now.
Yeah, it has been really interesting seeing that trend, collide with the reality of people being under lockdown. And I do think there is something very satisfying about optimizing the things you can. And there are people trying to figure out how to make do with what they have, from a financial standpoint, from a time and availability standpoint, from a wellness standpoint, so from a social standpoint. So I do think that people are thinking a lot about how to create better lives for themselves in a way that is really similar at its core to the trends we were seeing in terms of like the things you can buy and do to fix your sleep and your diet and your home and all of that.
I think the first really big article that caught people's attention in this space, I think it's called the quantified self space, must have been around like 2003, 2004, might even have been earlier, in Wired magazine with Gary Wolf and Kevin Kelly. And it really, of course, that was, San Francisco, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley people love the QS space and measuring everything, I know I'd emailed you about, I still want to do something on biohacking because I think that's sort of the next level of the quantified self space, right?
Definitely. We have had a lot of increased interest in the microbiome over the last couple of years.
Right. Yeah, a lot of books out on that too. And a lot of pickled vegetables and kombucha.
Yeah. So obviously at Popular Science, we've been interested in the idea of like the bacteria and the viruses and the fungi that naturally live in and on us and around us. That's just inherently fascinating to us.
So that's the whole microbiome?
Yeah. So your microbiome is kind of a loose term because you have, your physical microbiome, like the in, on, and around your body. But people also talk about like your home microbiome, meaning your house's, colonies of all different kinds of microbes. And then you have, more specific physical microbiomes like your gut microbiome, because we had a great piece on this in an issue of PopSci that was this beautiful map of the human body showing all of the different colonies of microbes that are there, because it really is like a whole world. Your belly button has more in common with the microbiome of somebody else's belly button than like your belly button does with your foot. So
okay, we need to do a whole separate talk on.
Oh gosh, absolutely, anytime.
Belly buttons.
But yeah, so every part of your body has this like very specific microbiome, and it's a new field of research, really. I mean, of course, people have been studying this for ages, but it's only in the last few years where genetic sequencing has got to the point where we can really get into the nitty-gritty of what these microbes are, and we're discovering more microbes. And so then the next step was connecting them to our health and asking, well, we see that people have these different kinds of colonies of microbes in their gut. So how does that affect weight, mood, your risk of different diseases? And so we're at the point now where we have causal relationships for like just a couple things. We have relationships that we're not sure whether or not they're causal for a lot of things. And so that's been another big trend, is that people are fascinated by the microbiome, and it's because they're hoping they can optimize it, right? They're hoping they can eat the right thing, take the right pill to change their gut microbiome into a good one, or, you know,
Are you able to tell whether that's geographical within your audience or not? Is that possible? Or can you sort of tell just from hearsay?
I would say that the wellness optimization is definitely a very American thing. I think it is very informed by like the Silicon Valley tech culture kind of bleeding out into what we talk about and what we want to buy and do. But microbiome research is starting to get more global for sure, especially because it does vary a lot from country to country and lifestyle to lifestyle. So there's starting to be really interesting work from around the world on, you know, who has the best microbiomes and what that means.
Okay, well, sliding over, I mean, we sort of moved in that direction. Tell us some weird science stories from this week.
Yeah. So one from today that I think is very weird for a lot of people is that we're going to have snow in the United States this weekend.
What?
Right, because of the polar vortex, which is a climate phenomenon that is always there. We always have the...
It really exists? Are you sure?
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know.
Always there.
My skeptical eye on you. Polar vortex. That sounds like a front page piece.
Well, it's actually, polar vortex is one of several weather-related terms that has only really gained popular use because of how it sounds. Okay. Every time there's a snowstorm and people talk about bomb cyclones, a bomb cyclone isn't inherently worse than any other snowstorm, and it's not a new term. It's just that someone realized that it would sound really good in a headline.
Good for clicks. Good for people, you know, buying the newspaper.
Yeah. And so the polar vortex is just what we call these swirls of cold air at the North and South Pole. And they usually... Where's it going to be? So this is going to be Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and Midwest. So pretty far spread. Basically everywhere there's not currently a heat wave, okay, there's going to be record low temperatures. So basically part of the polar vortex got caught by the jet stream. It's just getting tugged down south. And it is very late in the season for that to happen. This is the kind of thing that normally happens in the winter, but it's Arctic air, so no matter what time of year it is, when it comes down, it's really cold. And yeah, they're expecting, I think, at least 50 temperature records are expected to be broken. And the snow is mostly going to be in like the extreme northeast of the US. I think only Maine is expected to get bad snow, but a lot like Albany, Newark, New Jersey might get some snow. So that surprised me. And yeah, even if there's no snow where you are, a lot of people in the US are going to have really cold weekends. So I guess it's good that most of us aren't going outside.
That's for sure. Okay, what else have you got?
So there was this study that came out earlier this week about ancient frog fossils in Antarctica. And that's weird enough to think about because, you know, the only thing you're going to find in Antarctica now are penguins and very lonely researchers. But it was once a green and wet place, and it had lots of animals, including frogs. But what's really cool about these frogs is that they are very closely related to frogs that live in what is now Chile and in the Andes Mountains, which are also very close relatives of extinct frogs that lived in what is now Australia.
Oh, okay. So all at some point kind of joined up together many million years ago?
Yeah. So back when, so originally the whole planet was one continent, Pangea, but then there was an intermediary kind of bunch of supercontinents, and one of them was called Gondwana. And I mean, we call it that now. Nobody was there to call it Gondwana at the time. But so this is actually a really satisfying archaeological find, because what is now Antarctica was right between what is now Chile and what is now Australia, on this supercontinent of Gondwana. So these Antarctic frogs link these Australian and these Chilean frogs. So they did, I think our headline was, how did frogs get from Australia to America? Easy, they hopped across Antarctica, which is just so much fun. So I love that. It's a great reminder that archaeology isn't just like dig up some bones and, you know, throw them on a table. Sometimes you have to know all about ancient supercontinents to understand why you have three very similar frogs on opposite sides of the planet.
And now there's going to be a ton of archaeologists down in Antarctica.
Oh yeah, it's definitely an area where people are really excited to find what lived there. Because again, when these frogs were there, which was, I want to say it was like 40 million years ago, it was very warm and very wet. So there were probably lots of different kinds of animals there. So.
I love it. Thank you for the stories. Are there any other ones that you should share? Is that?
I mean, well, we did have I don't know if you have heard about the murder hornets.
I mean, okay, so that is definitely something with the name of them and social media and everything that's going on in the world. People are like, no, the murder hornets. So I haven't read them because I found it so just like annoying.
That is absolutely fair.
That's my confirmation bias. Is I was like, I cannot. There are always hornets that are going to sting you.
Yeah. Well, and we did, you know, in our story, we pointed out like these aren't inherently more dangerous than other species of hornets that we have. I mean, they're nasty. You don't want to get stung by them. But one thing that's really cool is that the bees that have evolved to have these hornets as their predators, they do this thing called heat balling, where if a hornet, heat balling.
Okay.
Yeah. And if a hornet attacks them, the bees will swarm around the hornet, and they basically fly so fast around the hornet that their wings moving heat up the air, and they just like cook the hornet to death. Wow. And these are little honeybees.
A great video to have that, and then have like a frying pan. And like, this is what you guys should do at PopSci. For YouTube or for your various channels, and then have the bees chowing down on it. Like
yeah, we'll just have to get some murder hornets. It'll be fine.
You just do an animation of it. Oh wow, well that's amazing to hear how the bees look after themselves.
Yeah, it's really heartening. These are just like honeybees. And the murder hornets don't stand a chance. Unfortunately, our honeybees have not evolved to do that, but you know, maybe they'll learn. Maybe they'll figure it out.
Maybe if they subscribe to PopSci, they will.
That's true.
Well, thank you so much. I love this conversation.
Thank you.
And I love the weird science news. That would be fun to do more often too.
Yeah, totally.
For you to tell us which science news is real but weird.
Anytime.
So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. Bye.
Thanks, folks, for joining for today. We are going to be back in a couple of hours with a live DJ session at 6 p.m. West Coast time and 9 p.m. on the East Coast. DJ Tough Ghost is going to be spinning from Echo Park in LA. So you should tune back here and you'll get to hear her. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.